So hello everyone. Hello Don.
Hi, Raphael.
Thank you for being here. So the goal of this video is to interview you, to make an interview about this book. Everything must go. So I try to show it, but I have to find the rights. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Here it is. So this is quite a mythical book and very famous book in philosophy, in metaphysics, and so it talks about philosophy of physics and philosophy of social sciences, and so it makes very straightforward and claims, and it's also very polemical. So I think on purpose. So when I want to raise two sets of questions. First, obviously theoretical questions, but first I found it very interesting to raise questions about the history of the book, which I find quite fascinating because there are 4 authors on the cover, and the project also is. I mean, when I read the book, I had the impression that you really wanted to make like a provocation, and so I was wondering what is the story behind the book. So this was the first interview that I wanted to make with you, and so thank you for accepting the invitation.
Yes. So the history of the book is it grew out of interactions among the 4 of us with a number of other philosophers of science over several years at the Dubrovnik Philosophy of Science Conference. So every year going back to the 1950s, I think, there's been an annual small philosophy of science conference in Dubrovnik, organized mainly by Swedish and Canadian philosophers and some Polish ones. And for several years in a row, me and James Ladyman and David Spirit and John Collier were regular attendees at that event. And one of the nice things about that conference is, although it has very loose themes, people can present on whatever they want. And that allows for the conference, that allowed for the conference to have running conversations over several years. And so over 2 or 3 years at that conference, in particular, James and I found our general projects and views converging very closely. And it struck us that his formulation of ontic structural realism and the rainforest realism, my refinement of Dan Dennett's real patterns story, they seem to be exact complements to each other. They each seem to provide the crucial, to do the crucial work that the other left open. So that it seems to us that between the 2 of them, but if we fused them, we had something like a comprehensive philosophy of science. And then it occurred to us, because of the metaphysical aspect of Dennett's account of real patterns, we had, in addition, the makings of a naturalized metaphysics as well as a philosophy of science. Originally, we envisaged a book written equally by all 4 authors. But as things developed, gradually, James and I took over more and more of the project until finally, in the end of the day, we decided on that somewhat odd formulation, the odd structure that the book has, where since in the end, David and John only contributed text to a couple of chapters, we decided to, as it were, make the book a series of papers with a different team of authors on each chapter or each paper, if you like. But James and I are the first 2 authors of all chapters. So in some sense, it's his and my book, and with contributions from them. And we assembled it over a period of about 2 years, sharing text by email and making decisions about how text should best be arranged and so on. But then finally, at the end of the day, James and I sat down together in an office in Cape Town. And in one of the most intense work months of my life, we basically wrote the whole book in about a month.
Okay. And it's a
So
very dense book, very rich book. So in 1 month, so you had lots of material to compile.
yeah.
Okay, and so did you have some disagreements also with James Ladyman, or not at all? Or did you have to solve some of that disagreement problems? Or?
No, we found the actual synchronization of our views seamless. I don't recall us disagreeing about anything. Writing the book, many co-authored books, I think, are produced by a kind of division of labor, but in this case, we literally were sitting in the room together, composing sentence by sentence. And certainly there were things I didn't think of that he did, or that he would think of that I hadn't, or I would try a first formulation and he would see a whole problem with it, or vice versa. So we had lots of tactical issues, lots of little tactical issues to arrive at agreement on, but no significant philosophical disagreements, and we never have had. We still work together. We're in fact planning later this year to produce a paper that will revisit the book, in which we plan to make a few modifications, that we're in agreement about those two.
So and about the to settle the historical background of the book. So who had you in mind when you make this criticism of speculative metaphysics, and also what was your relation with Van Fraassen? Because Van Fraassen is an instrumentalist, you are a realist, but at the same time you used his stance framework to explain the way you relate to or you metaphysics, to use this word. So yeah, could you say a word about the landscape of the book at the time?
Yeah, well, of course, throughout in the 80s and 90s, the argument between standard scientific realists and constructive empiricists, well, specifically Van Fraassen, was one of the dominant arguments in philosophy of science. And it was, of course, a heavily dialectical kind of argument, a very productive one, it seems to me, in this, just what you want to see in a philosophical argument, in the sense that both sides made significant concessions and modifications as the argument proceeded. And so the positions, which initially seemed as far apart as possible, came closer and closer together on some crucial issues. Now, of course, the one area where there seemed like that there could be no possible kind of compromise was precisely realism about objects, realism about theoretical entities. That was, after all, the core disagreement in the first place. So although many of the subsidiary issues in the philosophy of science that Van Fraassen on the one hand and people like Richard Boyd on the other hand disagreed about, well, many of those subsidiary issues became zones of increasing agreement. There remained in that argument still the fundamental opposition over whether we should take theoretical unobservable entities ontologically seriously. But then, of course, we are precisely providing a reasons and a motivation for denying that the realist commitment should be a commitment to entities. Well, of course, at that point, it becomes now not so obvious whether we are empiricist-inflected realists or realist-inflected empiricists. And as we say in the book somewhere, I can imagine somebody making an argument that we ought to call ourselves empiricists rather than realists. And we can see that someone could make such an argument. So as we say in the book, well, then, that we don't necessarily have a problem with that. We're obviously, the substance of our view is what it is. And there's perhaps room for argument over how it should best be labeled. That, of course, echoes a comment Dan himself makes at the end of Real Patterns, when he also says, do you think this is instrumentalism or this is realism? Well, I don't care. The substance of the view is what it is. So we do provide some reasons towards the end of the book for thinking that that we still are entitled to the realist label, and or that's more informative than an empiricist label. But again, we recognize, I mean, not only, of course, are we sympathetic with many of Van Frossen's, many aspects of Van Frossen's attitude to doing metaphysics. We're also, we also are verificationists. Now we're Peircean verificationists rather than Vienna verificationists. But we certainly see the logical positivists as major predecessors and sources of inspiration. So there's another respect in which we certainly have at least half a leg in the empiricist tradition.
Okay, so yeah, I see the relation with Van Frossen. Just before the next question, could you just explain the difference between Peircean verificationist and the Carnapian verificationist?
Yeah, well, the most basic one is that, of course, for the Vienna, for logical positivists and logical empiricists, the verificationism is in the first place a claim about semantics, right? So unverifiable claims are said to be meaningless.
Yeah.
That was not Peirce's view. So Peirce's view was that ultimately scientific theories must have practical consequences to be taken seriously, and their import as science, not merely their adequacy, not just their empirical adequacy, but their status as potential contributors to science must be assessed in light of implications they have for interventions that could be made.
Okay.
So we're verificationists in that sense.
Yeah, it's true. In his paper, How to Make Our Ideas Clear, Peirce, so he's opposed to verbal discussions.
Yeah.
But he doesn't reduce the cognitive content to what is observable. It's more I think I understand what your point. So and Carnap, so he thinks that everything that has a meaning should come from the senses or from the experiments.
Yes.
Or be reduced to the verification conditions. So it's true that it's more tolerant to be a Peircean verificationist in a way.
Well, of course, the positivists were almost bound to any logical empiricist, logical positivist is bound to have a view like that, because ultimately for them, science is a matter of linguistic representations.
Yeah.
Right. So, but that's not the pragmatist account.
Yeah. Okay, and so you answered on the aspect of your relation with Van Frossen. How do you relate to empiricism in general? And so the second part of the question was how to relate to speculative metaphysicians. So because the first chapter of the book is quite direct in the criticism. So maybe you could say a word about who we were thinking of and why you thought it was necessary to make such a strong point. And also, in a way, Van Frossen had opened the fight, I would say, 5 years before. So yeah, just to explain also this aspect of the landscape of your book.
Yeah, well, of course, as the tone in that first chapter will suggest, we were motivated by what we saw as the sociological situation and the sociological dynamics that we experienced in philosophy. When I was a graduate student, the relative place of the relative weight of the philosophy of science in philosophy as a whole, at least in North America, where I did my PhD, was much greater than it was by the time we wrote the book. We could see philosophy of science, as it were, declining in relative importance within philosophy. And at the same time, and that concerned us, We wanted to know why philosophers were increasingly turning their attention to other things. When we thought about the kinds of questions that seemed to be pushing aside the kinds of the questions framed in terms of the philosophy that had been framed in terms of the philosophy of science just 15 or 20 years earlier, it seemed to us that the particular pathway that was leading a lot of the profession had been led down was a pathway that ultimately stemmed from the work of Kripke and Lewis, right? Interventions which at the time they were made were read by philosophers of science as inquiries from inside the philosophy of science. That is, they were tended to be interpreted by philosophers of science as extensions of the kind of questions philosophers of science were asking. But it was clear to us by the time we wrote the book that this program of doing a kind of respectable analytic metaphysics, that is a metaphysics that could be deemed respectable in the analytic culture, it seemed to us that this thing had, instead of just being a kind of side propedeutic to philosophy of science and to philosophy of language, it had taken on and philosophy of mind, it had taken on a kind of life of its own. It had become an enterprise being pursued for its own sake. Also, both James and I interact at least as much with scientists in our respective areas of interest as we do with philosophers. I've been a professor of economics for nearly 25 years. And my principal interactions are with economists. James, in the philosophy department at University of Bristol, is deeply involved in working groups and on a continuous basis with physicists and mathematicians and applied mathematicians there. So we're quite aware of how philosophy of science is perceived by the scientists with whom we work. And another thing that disturbed us was the extent to which scientists were just losing respect for philosophy. And when we talked with scientists about their reasons for being so impatient with philosophers and increasingly regarding philosophers as not people who were part of the same enterprise as they are, they tended to allude to the kinds of debates which had been increasingly taking center stage as a result of the process I mentioned a minute ago, the metaphysics, analytic metaphysics taking on a life of its own as a self-sustained and self-sustaining project. And we were also, there was a kind of coincidence. It happened for basically accidental reasons that within a 1 year period, James and I found ourselves in attendance at philosophical meetings, at a couple of philosophical conferences, which were supposed to be general philosophical conferences, but which were very heavily dominated by analytic metaphysicians. So within that space of a year, we found ourselves sitting through quite a lot of talks and discussions, which seemed to us to be completely empty and most importantly, completely irrelevant to science. And we found ourselves in paper after paper at those conferences, raising what amounted to verificationist objections to the whole discussion. And so, we didn't conceive of Everything Must Go as an extension of chapter 1. We conceived of it as the unification of ontic structural realism and rainforest realism. And so we had conceptualized the core central chapters of the book first. Chapters, in particular, chapters 3 and 4, and 5, which is where the real positive view is. But it was as we realized that this was a naturalistic metaphysics, it also occurred to us that that's how we should frame it. We should frame it as a naturalistic metaphysics, raised as an alternative to this analytic approach that we, in our view then, and it's still my view, was undermining the credibility of philosophy as a contributing piece of the general scientific inquiry into the nature of reality. And we decided, and we indeed decided when we decided to write chapter 1 and use it to frame and launch the book, we quite deliberately made it provocative, not for the sake of being provocative, but because we thought, well, we wanted to be clear that we're raising a challenge here and we're very serious about it. Right? We think we don't just think these people, this isn't a normal philosophical disagreement we have with these people. While we certainly don't doubt their sincerity, their good faith, their how learned they are, we do think that the focus on that activity is ultimately institutionally and sociologically dangerous to philosophy, because it harms, it causes philosophy to drift to the extent that it becomes dominant practice or a dominant practice in philosophy. It has the effect of distancing from philosophy from the other domains of inquiry, and risks leaving philosophy stranded as a self-contained enterprise that will not be potentially viewed as relevant or interesting to anyone other than the philosophers practicing it. So yeah, we cared. We thought we saw chapter 1 as written in defense of philosophy.
So what you say that it was all, so the polemical tone of the book is the result almost of a moral coding or moral dimension, that you felt that it was your responsibility to kind of save philosophy from a bad path it was taking.
Yeah, well, of course, many philosophers have written that from that point of view. We're not unusual in taking that line. I mean, it does not seem to me correct to say that the book as a whole is polemical. Chapter 1 is polemical.
Yeah, I agree.
Thereafter, I don't think we are. Thereafter, we try to be quite careful. But it really, of course, is only chapter 1 where we directly engage analytic metaphysicians at all. You know, one of our stronger working methods in the book, and it's also, of course, it reflects an actual premise in the content of our naturalized metaphysics, is, in our view, any metaphysical thesis should be directly motivated from concerns arising from science and scientific practice. So the structure of the book, we were quite self-conscious about the structure of the book after chapter 1. And this is related to what has been so far the most consistent misreading of the book, the one we've had. One of the things we'll therefore focus on in the paper we're writing now. Quite a lot of people read chapter 2 as providing some crucial arguments for rainforest realism. In fact, as we say in the book, the only purpose of chapter 2 is to tie the arguments and discussions in the rest of the book into themes with which philosophers of science are familiar. But all of the argument, the actual argument, doesn't start until chapter 3. And in chapter 3, all the premises are coming from physics.
Yeah.
So ultimately, the architecture of the book is something like this. We address the epistemologists or the metaphysicians in chapter 1. But since we view that whole metaphysical project, that analytic metaphysical project, as an error, naturally, in engaging them, we don't engage them in their own terms. we can't engage them in their own terms because we don't accept their terms.
Mm.
So inevitably, that chapter where we address the metaphysicians was bound to be tendentious. And we saw no reason to beat around the bush. Given that we did plan to write without, in a not particularly gentle way, one rule we also adopted was that if we were going to say particularly frank and unqualified critical things about some philosophers, we would do so only, we would make sure that our targets were, as it were, bigger than us. So if you notice when those passages that perhaps have rubbed some philosophers the wrong way for their tone and tenor, if you actually go through and see where those are, they arise when we're, for example, arguing with David Lewis, or people of that or Kripke, people of that stature. So, and as we as we said to each other when we were writing some of those sentences that we knew would raise some eyebrows, we said, well, David Lewis is big enough to stick up for himself. So that's all right. And then chapter 2 addresses the rest of the philosophical community, particularly philosophers of science and epistemologists. Again, not to make arguments, but here at least when we turn to them, we're in a discussion with philosophers whose project we share in many ways. So naturally, the tone there becomes more normal. But again, I want to stress, those are not the arguments.
Mm.
That chapter really is a chapter of conceptual bridge building. So we can build bridges from the debates as they conceive them in their terms, or in more traditional terms, in terms of the more radical kind of argumentation we start in chapter 3. So we see chapters 3, 4, and 5 as the real core of the book.
Yeah. So this we'll talk about in the next interview. So I had a question about the effects on the community of your book. So what were the effects, and were these effects those that you were expecting or not at all? Were you satisfied with the result or not?
So but the one area where James and I had some differences was not with respect to what we put in the book, but we had somewhat divergent predictions about how it would be received. I think James expected that the metaphysicians, the analytic metaphysicians we had criticized, would engage in debate with us almost immediately. I wasn't so sure, and it seems to me I was closer to being right than James was. So a couple of analytic metaphysicians published reviews of our book, which were not friendly, as we would have expected. I mean, it would have been very surprising if none had bothered to stick up for themselves. The implication would be they didn't think our book was even worth noticing. Now, a couple of people did stick up for analytic metaphysics, but actually, on the whole, the analytic metaphysics community did not pay much attention to the book. Again, I wasn't surprised. I mean, academic culture doesn't well lend itself to arguments over the viability of a whole school of thought, at least not immediately. Not while people are still, I mean, we often have arguments over the viability of old schools of thought that are now only visible as practiced in our rearview mirrors. But people who are actually engaged in a research enterprise like analytic metaphysics, what of course they want to do is analytic metaphysics. Not for them, it's calling them away from their central occupation to ask them to go off and have an argument about whether they should be doing what they're doing.
Mm.
So I wasn't so surprised that the metaphysics community didn't much engage with us initially. But I hoped that the book would reach, in particular, younger philosophers, and that as those younger philosophers became more mature philosophers, the book would have some influence on them that way. And it seems to me we've been terrifically, that hope has been really nicely borne out. The rate of citation of the book has been rising every year since about 2013, 2014. So in other words, we had more citations in 2021 than in 2020. We had more in 2020 than in 2019. And now we're up close to 2,000 citations. And I have noted that there's always been substantially more interest in the book in Europe than in the US. I think that reflects differences in the extent to which philosophers in the two communities engage with other disciplines. Right? It seems to me the extent of philosophers' engagement with social scientists in particular, but also with biologists and with other, and even with physicists, is significantly greater in Europe than it is in North America, in the US. With a few important departments accepted. I mean, what's sort of happened to the philosophical dynamic in America is that you've got a few departments where the philosophers are as engaged with science as any ever were. Duke, for example, San Diego, still Wisconsin to some extent. But then you also have departments like NYU, and NYU is a more typical American philosophy department, where there's virtually no engagement of the philosophers with other scientists. So that's more a hunch. I haven't done any bibliometric research to back it up. But my explanation as to why we have had a generally friendlier and more engaged reception over the years in Europe is that I think European philosophers just are more likely to see themselves as part of a larger project of inquiry that goes beyond philosophy, as opposed to being insular, than is the case in America. So yeah, I mean, now in retrospect, we're very proud of the book, because I mean, it seems to us to have had as much influence as we could reasonably have expected it might. And it's had it in the best way. I mean, I'd rather influence younger people who sort of extend the view through their careers, through the issues they choose to think about, or the way they frame problems. I mean, that's a deeper and more interesting kind of influence than just getting a lot of citations when your book first comes out. Having lots of intense inside baseball on the specific details of what you say, and then of course that's much of that is forgotten as everybody moves on to the next thing. So
it would be an interesting survey to make among naturalistic philosophers, current naturalistic philosophers, to know what was the impact of the book on their decision. It would be interesting. Yes, that you were, because I think this is what I found so interesting in your book as a social phenomenon, since you have these communities, and normally if you don't agree with the very basic rules of the community, you don't try to talk. It's not the same game. So disagreements just occur within the community. But right. What you did is that you really, it's something very, very special, that one community tried to criticize the other and the rules of that the other play. And so it's true that it wouldn't make sense that the other players would say, okay, we stop playing this game because now we are old and we are so good at it, so we cannot just learn a new game. But it's true that for the new players, they still have the choice, and you help people at the crossroads to realize that there is a choice to make, and to decide what to do. So it would be an interesting survey.
Yeah, well, that nicely describes, Raphael, that nicely describes our ambition as we saw it at the time, right? We were trying to point an alternative way. Because of course it's, there, after all, as you pointed out earlier, there was already Van Frossen and other people out there, and Rorty, and many people who had been arguing already that metaphysics as practiced, or metaphysics even tout court, was a barren enterprise and did not deliver truth or enlightenment. So we were not by any means the first people to say that. But of course, we were not arguing. Where we differ from Rorty and Van Frossen is we do not reject metaphysics. We think there is a place for it in the best structure of inquiry, and provided it stays closely hitched to science, indeed, provided it is motivated by science.
Yeah, so for me, I think I was coming from philosophy of science and the question of scientific realism, and I think your work and Lady Man's work, also Chakravarti's work, really showed me that we need to do metaphysics to do science, so to do philosophy of science. So, and the question how to do useful metaphysics and not speculative metaphysics was raised by you and Van Frossen. So I found his book very interesting, but it prohibited doing metaphysics. So so it's true that you really helped to, I think, show way. Also, for me, Chakravarti was also an important book. Your book and Chakravarti, they both.
Yeah. Well, in fact, Anjan was also one of the participants in the Dubrovnik workshops. So Anjan was very much part of those conversations I described at the beginning of the interview tonight.
Mm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So I had two more questions. So so you already said that you were writing a paper with James Ladyman about like an update of your book. So I just wanted to know what would you change in your book if you had to rewrite it now?
Well, we haven't really dug deep into the paper yet. It's planned for a little bit later. We're going to do it a little bit later this year. I'm finishing a book right now with another co-author. We have a very, very hard deadline, so I'm focused on that. But what James and we've sketched out what we want to do in this paper. There are two main moves we're going to make, or two main suggestions we'll make that we think will help clarify what we mean to be saying in the original book. We think we made two tactical errors in the book. One was we think we should not have spoken as we do about the kind of physics that we consider not to be a special science. We think it's misleading that we refer to it as fundamental physics, because it confuses our general anti-fundamentalist stance. Quite a lot of readers get mixed up about whether we're defending a kind of fundamentalism or anti-fundamentalism. Well, we certainly mean to be defending anti-fundamentalism in just about every philosophically deep sense of that phrase. So we will reformulate what we take to be the difference between the parts of physics that are not special sciences and the parts that are. And we prefer to call the non-special parts of physics universal physics, by which we just mean physics that applies everywhere in the universe at all scales. Mm-hmm. And the more so, that, of course, is mostly a terminological fix, but it's an important one, and it will allow us to say more and to clarify further, we think, in terms that are more likely to, less likely to cause confusion, to clarify further exactly how we see the relationship between physics and metaphysics. Then the other more substantial thing we think needs some reworking is our specification of real pattern, of what it is to be a real pattern. In chapter 4 of the book is framed in terms of computability. And all of the discussion really presupposes a classical computationalist understanding of information processing. But of course, it's another theme of the book that the universe, as far as science seems to be showing us, is dynamic, is a big dynamical system, and is dynamical all the way down. And cognitive science and associated disciplines have shown us that though, of course, in some abstract sense, any physical system that processes information is a computer. And in a very abstract sense, any episode of information process can be modeled as computing a function, can be represented as computing a Boolean function. At the level of abstraction to which one must typically ascend in order to talk about the functions that are computed by, for example, a multi-layer neural network or an economy, right? The level of abstraction one must rise to talk about those computations in terms of input-output functions is so fantastically abstract that it risks leading us down by another path, the very thing we worry about in much philosophy and its relationship to science, that one simply drifts away from, one loses a grip on in connection with the details of the actual modeling that scientists are doing. And that this partly reflects a kind of parallel development in my work as an economist. For years, we typically modeled our data using maximum likelihood mixture models, which can be straightforwardly represented in reduced form. But increasingly now we analyze our data using hierarchical Bayesian methods, the same kinds of methods that, of course, are becoming more and more prominent across many sciences, all the social sciences and biological sciences, and that are dominating work in cognitive science. We think we need it's not so much it's not taking back anything we say in chapter 4, but it's rather expressing rainforest realism in a format that is reworking the analysis in a format that that makes more use of mathematics and less use of logic. Right? So if we understand abstract theory of computation as ultimately logic in motion, as ultimately a kind of logic programming, then that is one highly abstract way of characterizing information flow. But it puts, of course, no emphasis at all on the flow part. So scientists ultimately describe the world using mathematics, not logic. Formal logic is just one very special and somewhat strange part of mathematics. It's not the foundation. It's not among the foundations of mathematics. Then, of course, we have specific issues coming from physics. I mean, it's just Jeff Boob argued 40 years ago that one should not try to discuss the formal structure of quantum theory on set theoretic foundations. One needs group theory or some type theory, and because set theory is just too promiscuous. It doesn't force one to make any commitments of an ontological kind about anything.
Yeah.
So Janan Ismail, in a workshop on our book 13 years ago, said made the forceful point in her commentary that we weren't true to some of our own claims. And we claim in the book that ultimately metaphysics should be done using mathematics. But then she said, when you actually come to state some specific metaphysical hypotheses in chapter 4, you state them in information theoretic terms, which basically is you're using logic. So let's see some real mathematics there.
Mm.
So that's one of the main, that'll be one of the main things in our paper.
Yeah, that was very exciting.
So
yeah, so my last question was the question I wanted to begin with, but I think it's good to finish by this question if people didn't know you before. And it's a question that I think pops up in the mind when one listens to you. And so first the question was about the book as a sociological phenomenon, and I had a question about Don Ross as a human phenomenon.
Oh.
So that's because when I listen to you, I don't really know whether you're an experimental economist that is an incredible philosopher, or an incredible philosopher which is also incredible experimental economist. So I don't know your story. I don't know where you come from, and I don't know. So there's first the question of the genesis of you, and also how it works in your everyday life, because it's two very, in my mind, before I met you, it's just two opposite worlds, and yeah, so I'm very curious about these two aspects of the problem.
Well, before I talk about the backstory, I'll tell you what I actually spend quite a lot of time working on is neither of those things, neither experimental economics nor philosophy. I spend a lot of time on doing a kind of economics that has nothing really, no philosophical. Well, I was going to say no philosophical aspect at all, but actually it does. But I am heavily involved in optimizing the design of road surfaces in South Africa. Okay. And I've been working on that for 20 years. That actually does have a philosophical aspect, though, because for reasons I won't get into here, it's a long digression and it's interesting mainly to economists. But when we do our road optimization work, my colleague who I do most of this work with and I, when we don't use standard cost benefit analysis, we don't use standard cost benefit analysis for reasons having to do with Ken Binmore's critique of utilitarianism. Right. Binmore had argued that that although utilitarianism, the specific form of utilitarianism that is embodied in cost benefit analysis is an optimizing program, a welfare optimizing program. It doesn't produce stable results because invariably lots of stakeholders regard the solutions as unjust and therefore work to undermine the stability of the result rather than sort of accept their loser's wage. And Binmore then, of course, showed in considerable detail how if you actually follow the kind of bargaining that in political economy that leads you to stable solutions, what you get is the Rawlsian second best. So I tell my clients, my consulting clients in government and in international agencies, that we follow a method that allows us to produce Rawlsian solutions. So we teach a bit of philosophy to road pavements engineers. But anyway, that's a digression. To your question. So my background is when I decided to go to graduate school, I intended to be an empirical scientist. And it was actually Dan Dennett who talked me out of it. Dan said that I was interested in too many things to be an empirical scientist, that if I became an empirical scientist, I would be absolutely forced to choose some area of work and spend my whole life on it. Some very focused, highly specialized thing, and just dig into it for a long. And so Dan said, he used a line that I'll never forget. One of the most important things anyone ever said to me. He said, if you institutionally become a philosopher, you can read anything you want and call it work. And that seemed to be an irrefutably convincing thing to have said. But in fact, what I was interested in was the other person who was a huge inspiration to me when I was young was Douglas Hofstadter. And it was reading some of Doug's more popular work that got me fascinated with cognitive science and AI. And so what I finally ultimately enrolled in as my PhD program was an interdisciplinary program in cognitive science at University of Western Ontario. And this was the 80s. So there weren't yet cognitive science programs that were standalone. Any cognitive science program had to be hosted somewhere. So the cognitive science program at Western was hosted in the philosophy department there, but now the philosophy department at Western was pretty much exclusively a philosophy of science department. It basically was a satellite of Pittsburgh. And there were lots of faculty exchanges between Western and Pittsburgh. So it was kind of Pittsburgh North. So it was already there was a philosophy of science environment. And I was specifically doing the cognitive science program. The cognitive science program rules said you needed to do your comprehensive exams in philosophy of science, and then also in one of psychology or computer science. But I wanted to do connectionism. So I wasn't happy with either of those other options, those outside options, psychology or computer science. I mean, I did my mandatory course in logic programming and so on, but I didn't want to intensely study that. And I didn't want to intensely study, and the psychology departments then were complete, insofar as they were doing cognitive science, they were fully in the grip of the classical program. So in order to learn the math that I was going to need for doing work in connectionism, and my thesis was in fact was a neural network. So to learn that math, the best department was economics. So I was able to talk the program director into letting me do my comprehensive exams in philosophy of science and economics. And therefore I did PhD courses in economics as well as in philosophy of science. And then when I graduated, one of the first early discoveries I made, so now I was a kind of young connectionist theorist. Well, of course, one of the first discoveries I made, this was 1990, the theory at that point was far, far ahead of the engineering in connectionism. I mean, Geoff Hinton was running some interesting simulations. There was Danny Hillis, who built the connection machine at MIT, but on the whole, there weren't consulting opportunities in connectionism. And it's always been an important value of mine as an academic to be somehow, somewhere, truly engaged in some kind of engineering, something that causes actual changes you can work on, that you can see on the ground somewhere. Hence my work on roads for many years. I mean, you can see roads on the ground. There they are. You can drive on them. So at that point, I just because of my interest in doing applied work, I started from the beginning doing more and more of focusing more and more on what I had taken out of my coursework in economics, my PhD level coursework in economics. And eventually when I did a lot of work in game theory, in applied game theory as a result early on. So at University of Cape Town, where I moved in 2006, they had world-class economics department, a big one, but they had no game theorist. So they basically hired me as the game theorist and to introduce game theory into that environment. I still was not doing experiments at that point. That piece came shortly. That piece came in around 2007, 2000. Sorry, did I say 2006? No, I moved to South Africa in I'm 10 years off. I moved to Cape Town in 1996.
Okay.
1996, sorry. That's, yeah. So I've been in an economics department since then. But then, yeah, the experimental piece came in around 2008. I had known Glenn Harrison when I was at Western. He had been at Western at the time. And we had sort of kept a connection. And when I became interested in neuroeconomics as it was coming into view around 2004, 5, 6, I had some immediate issues with the way it developed. And I was particularly worried about the kind of econometrics that were being used. That is, neuroeconomists, most neuroeconomists seem to me to be insufficiently motivated by important econometric concerns, and were tending to borrow psychometrics. And Glenn shared similar concerns. So, and Glenn had also been drifting into doing economic experiments after an earlier career, mainly as an applied game theorist and a trade theorist. So we joined forces around 2008, 9, 10, and then institutionally and officially joined forces when the Center for the Economic Analysis of Risk was created, with Glenn as director and me as a program director in 2010. And our mandate was to do experiments, and the mandate of that center was to run experiments. So it's now been about 12 years that I've been this thing in terms of just what takes up the hours of my week, experiments more than anything else. So yeah, that's, I mean, but I guess to summarize all that, it's not that I was at first a philosopher of science and then decided to add economics, or the other way around. I've really been doing both my whole career. And now, of course, I'm also I'm in Ireland. I'm the head of a school called the School of Society, Politics and Ethics, which is the philosophy department is part of it, but it also includes a sociology department, a government and politics department. So it's a kind of general integrated social science school, and we also teach some public policy.
So do you feel that in a way you so you know in your current situation you do what Dennett told you that you shouldn't do, that you're focused on one point and or not?
Well, no, I mean, look, so thanks to Dan, I get to work on Tuesday on roads, and on Wednesday and Thursday on economic experiments, and on Friday I think about naturalized metaphysics with James Ladyman. So
yeah,
no, I'm exactly, Dan was exactly right.
Yeah. So he really understood who you are and what you needed. Yeah.
Yeah, he's been the principal mentor throughout my career, a wonderful person, and the most important professional person, most important person in my professional life. Yeah.
And I think that in a way you work also on roads with Everything Must Go, because as you described it, you wanted to to show the roads to the younger generations, and so it's also an engineering process in a way. So
yeah, well, once many years ago, I was giving a keynote to a conference of road pavement engineers, and it was part of an extended trip. So the pavement engineers were gathering in Johannesburg, and then I was flying on from Johannesburg to London, where I was going to be presenting some work with James on naturalized metaphysics. And these were the days before PowerPoints, and one would show overheads. You know, you had this big overhead machine with a light bulb, and you would put a piece of plastic on the screen. And so when I left my hotel room that morning, I grabbed the file that I thought had the transparencies for the road pavement engineers, and put my first transparency up in front of them, and oops, it was about quantum theory and quantum and metaphysics of scientific unification. So that was an oops moment. I had to ad lib the entire talk to the pavement engineers, who clearly thought a crazy person had was standing up in front of them. So.
And now, if you had an advice to someone who wants to study philosophy and philosophy of science and metaphysics, what would it be for someone who wants to do a PhD, for instance? Or if you just to summarize your view and just give like a take-home message.
Well, you know, I feel very concerned for young philosophers these days. You know, the job market has become so fantastically tight. And the young philosophers, to be competitive on that job market, you know, now it's virtually impossible to go straight from the PhD. As you know, when I was young, one people I did, and many did, most went straight from a PhD to a tenure track job. So you were immersed in teaching from the start, but a reasonable teaching load. And you know, now of course people need therefore to do at least a couple of postdocs typically, because when we hire philosophers at UCC, when we put a short list together of say 6 or 7 people, all of them will have 4 or 5 publications in good journals. And we're only going to be able to hire one of them. And there are people out there, young people with growing publication records in excellent journals, who are still struggling to find a job because there are so few permanent jobs. So I worry about these people, and therefore young philosophers need to be strategic about what areas of expertise they will develop, so that they can make sure they've got an area of expertise that will impress university administrations that are trying to build interdisciplinary centers and that are tend to be very preoccupied with social relevance, with showing the community that the academy contributes directly to community goals. Well, that's pretty hard if the only thing you know anything about is, let's say, the foundations of mathematics. Or you know, you're an Aristotle scholar. So I think it's really unfortunate. I mean, it's a bad thing that a young person cannot reasonably now say, I'm going to be an expert on the ancient Greek philosophers, and I'm going to really seriously learn ancient Greek, which is of course a massive investment, and that's what I'm going to do. And that's all I'm going to do, because boy, that's a full-time job and a half to do it well.
Yeah.
You know, it's a great loss to society that that's not a very sensible career decision for a person. I regret that young philosophers now really need to think, and if I want to study Aristotle, what else must I also study to make myself marketable? But there are still, however, there are areas, they are still coming along, where there's genuine demand for philosophers. We had a PhD student graduate from UCC just now this year, who wrote his thesis on ethical issues related to AI and, you know, in particular to to autonomous vehicles and autonomous systems. And he got to turn down job offers because he had several.
Yeah.
So,
Let's hope.
so there still are some areas. Right?
Yeah.
So the Aristotle specialist might have to also do some, AI ethics or climate change work or something.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dan. So it was very interesting. Yeah, I learned a lot, and I hope that people will also have learned a lot and get the drive to read the book if they didn't read it, and yeah, follow your work. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you very much for motivating the interview and for that excellent conference earlier this year where we got to know each other. So and we'll talk again soon.
Yeah,